Hello and welcome to the Charlotte Museum of History's African American Heritage Festival History Talks Lecture. My name is Adria Vogt. I'm the president and CEO of the Charlotte Museum of History. It is my pleasure to be here with you all tonight. I want to thank you for joining us for this special event, which is part of the Ron Hankins History Talks Lecture Series, sponsored by Wells Fargo. Tonight's program was originally scheduled to happen in June to coincide with the museum's African American Heritage Festival. It's an annual event that recognizes and honors Black history and culture in Charlotte. At the end of this program, we will have time for questions from the audience. So as you're listening, please feel free to type your questions directly into the comments. And as you're watching, we'll discuss them after the program with our guest. Introducing tonight's speaker this evening is a longtime museum friend and supporter, Tomcottingham. Tom is a retired lawyer, having spent more than 40 years in the field, with 21 of those in Charlotte. After his retirement, he was appointed to the North Carolina Commission for Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services by Governor Cooper. Tom's wife, Jeannie, serves on the museum's Board of Trustees, and we are so grateful that she roped Tom into this program this evening. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm Tom Cottingham. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Anthony Foxx, my friend and former colleague in law practice. The challenge for anyone introducing Anthony is that Anthony has done so much and accomplished so much in his career that it's hard to make the introduction shorter than Anthony's remarks, but I'm going to give it a shot. Anthony grew up in Charlotte, graduated from Davidson College. While at Davidson, during his junior year, he was elected president of the student body, the first African-American student to be president of the student body. After graduating from Davidson, he went to New York University Law School, top 10 law school. He was, while there, awarded the most prestigious scholarship NYU had. After graduating from NYU Law School, he clerked as on the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Again, very prestigious position, just one court below the Supreme Court. After clerking for a year on the Sixth Circuit, he went to D.C. There he worked in the Justice Department as a trial attorney, and then worked on Capitol Hill with the House Judiciary Committee. While there he met his wife, Samara. Then, with those credentials, Anthony could have gone anywhere he wanted to go in the country. Every law firm in the country would have hired him. Anthony decided to come to Charlotte. That's when I met Anthony. And I'll tell you that story briefly. I was an office managing partner for the law firm of Hunton & Williams in Charlotte. One day, I still remember this, one day the hiring partner came to the door of my office and said, "We have a young man here who has a great resume. Should we just go ahead and hire him, or do you want to talk with him first?" I said, "Well, let me see his resume." I looked at it and I said, "You're right. We're going to hire him, but I want to talk with him." From that day, Anthony and I saw each other virtually every day, talked almost every day for several years. In 2005, Anthony decided, to the detriment of law practice and the advantage of the city of Charlotte, to run for the city council, where he was elected. Then in 2008, he ran for mayor of Charlotte, became mayor in 2009. While mayor of Charlotte, the city expanded the airport, extended the light rail, held the Democratic National Convention. In 2013, President Obama, recognizing someone with real talent, appointed Anthony as Secretary of Transportation. As Secretary of Transportation, Anthony managed and was responsible for 55,000 employees and a budget of $70 billion. Just to put things in perspective, I think I read in the paper, Charlotte Observer, just this morning, that Charlotte's annual budget is $2.7 billion. So Anthony had a big responsibility and carried it off very well. In 2018, Anthony joined Lyft, the ride-hailing company, as executive vice president in charge of policy, and that's where Anthony is today. Anthony's married to his wife, Samara. They have two children, a son, Zachary, and a daughter, Hillary. So welcome, Anthony, and it's very good to see you again.
Great to see you, Tom. It's always great to be in your company. And, I have to say this because I don't get a chance to say this publicly about Tom, but there are few people in my life who've been better mentors than you, Tom. You were not only a great law partner, but a great friend and mentor. And it's great to spend some time with you and Jeannie through this process.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I appreciate that. Thank you. It was easy with you, though.
So how do we want to proceed? You want me to just go?
Yes. Take off.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to join the Charlotte Museum of History. When Tom and Jeannie approached me about doing this program, I was excited to do it, both because of Charlotte and because of history. I was a history major at Davidson College, and I believe that history tells us both where we've been, but also gives us clues as to where we are and where we're likely to be, and also gives us some opportunities to maybe rethink some things that maybe we wouldn't ordinarily if we didn't dig into it a little bit. So I think the role of the Charlotte Museum of History is really critical because as wonderful a city as Charlotte is, and as great a community as we've tried to establish over many years, we still have a lot of work to do, and a lot of that work is grounded in where we've come from as a community. So it's a pleasure to be here. Let me maybe start with kind of giving you a perspective on what I want to say tonight, and it really falls down into a couple of basic points. The most fundamental point is, I know we're dealing with what I call the 3 C's right now: COVID, climate, and if I might, the color line. I think those topics are ones that are very different in some ways, but in some ways they also are tied together, because in order to deal with them effectively, we have to have action at a macro level, but we also have to ourselves individually and as community members take actions that will help us overcome those things. So I think the first point that I want to make is that there's nothing I'm going to say here tonight that is in any way a way of saying that the problems, the challenges, the issues, the history that we have all been part of through generations, that any of that is insurmountable. In other words, I'm a firm believer that the future has infinite capacity to be better than the past or the present. And I believe that firmly about Charlotte. I believe it firmly about North Carolina. I believe it firmly about the country. And I want to say that because as I talk about some aspects of our shared history, they're kind of painful, and they trouble us, and they leave us sometimes feeling like the issues and the challenges are insurmountable. They're not. What human beings can do can be undone. Injustices can be corrected. All sorts of changes are possible. And so I want to infuse what I have to say tonight with a fair amount of optimism. Secondly, you've got to know that Charlotte is home for me. And Tom gave you some outlines of my background, but let me dig a little deeper into that. I was born on April 30th, 1971. Now, that date probably means nothing to anybody but me, but there are two things about it that I think are important tonight. The first is that it means that I turned 50 this year. This is probably the first year where I felt like I actually have enough information to maybe sound wise, if not be wise. But the second point about April 30th, 1971, is that my birth came 10 days after the Swan decision was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in Charlotte. And anybody who spent 10 minutes in Charlotte knows how important that decision was. So I grew up at a time when the city was sorting out, to use the words of Tom Hange, sorting out how to manage this big ball of fire that the Supreme Court sent into our school system, saying that busing was a legal means by which to desegregate the schools. Now, the other part of my story is that I was raised by my mom, who was 19 at the time I was born, and my grandparents. And my grandparents had been educators in North Carolina their entire careers. My grandfather, for example, had gone to what was then North Carolina Teachers College. It was now it's called Winston-Salem State, and then went and served in the military during World War II, and then got his master's degree from New York University, where I later went to law school. And he used that master's degree to become an administrator in the segregated school system. So he came back, he taught in a lot of places, Laurinburg, Wilkesboro for a while, Gaston County, where he was from, and ultimately ended his career in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system. My grandmother hails from Moore County, North Carolina, in the great metropolis of Carthage. She used to call it the ancient city. And in Carthage, she would talk about her father and her mother, who were, her father drove a truck and he hauled things. And her mother was a midwife. And she even remembered her grandmother, who herself was a slave. And she would tell stories about her grandmother as a young person. And I would hear these stories growing up. But the larger picture being that she went off to what was then North Carolina College for Negroes, now North Carolina Central. I want to make sure you get the terminology from then and now, and went to school under James Shepard, who was the founding president of that institution. So she majored in French, and hence my middle name, which is Renard, which, for those of you who know French, means fox in French. So that was a joke, I guess, that my grandmother played on me that continues to bear fruit. But they went through the twists and turns of the North Carolina school system of the time. And what that meant for them was that when my grandfather took over a school, my grandmother often taught at the same school because there was usually only one Black school in a given area. And to use Wilkesboro as an example, the school that my grandfather led there was called Lincoln Heights. And it was the only Black school within an hour or two range of the area. So he got students from all over the place. But when you were a Black administrator in a segregated school system, oftentimes you were not given resources to do basic things. So things like proms and dances and all the extra stuff. Often the kids and the families would have to raise money for those things. And if the money fell short and the principal was motivated, a lot of times the principal paid out of pocket. And my grandfather did that a lot, which I didn't understand as a child why my grandparents had two separate bank accounts. But then I understood once I understood how all that happened. So being a principal of a school, while it was an elevated position socially in society, was a critical servant position at the time. And so my grandfather oftentimes came out of pocket for all kinds of things. In fact, when I was running for mayor of Charlotte, someone stopped me and told me this story about how, my grandfather had helped him fill out a college application. And then he got into college, this guy got into college, and then he needed to go to Raleigh for some reason to fill out financial aid forms and had no way to get there. And my grandfather literally handed him the keys to his car. And that was just what you did. And so underneath this segregated system, you had people like that who were giving really more than what was expected in order to give the next generation a real opportunity. I want to pause there because there's another story under this story, which is that the Lincoln Heights School in Wilkesboro and the schools that my grandmother was educated in Carthage were Rosenwald schools, just like the school you're trying to preserve. And I don't know what the state of education of African Americans in the South in particular would have been had Booker T. Washington not convinced Rosenwald to make an initial investment in a few elementary schools in Alabama, and then later that was expanded to include full and sometimes partial contributions to school efforts across the South. But my life is literally infused with different examples of where Rosenwald schools played a role. So that's the context I grew up in. So I had these grandparents who had lived through the hand-me-downs of the segregated school system, the hardships of teaching in that system, the difficulty of just trying to make do themselves with their own family during that time. So when the busing decision came down and I started elementary school, the message I got in my family could have been, this is horrible because we just lost our jobs because the school's desegregated. My grandfather wasn't a principal anymore. He was a seventh grade math teacher, like many administrators from that system. They could have been very bitter about it, but they weren't. They said, look, you're going to have the best opportunity of anyone in the history of our family. And our entire mission is to see to it that you take full advantage of the opportunity you're given. And I didn't understand it as an elementary school kid, but I kept hearing it. And, over the summers, even as they were ending their teaching careers, they used to pull old SRA materials and, all kinds of books and things that were being tossed out by the school home. And I would just devour those things because I was racing to try to take advantage of this opportunity that they kept talking about. And anyhow, for me, education has been everything, and my grandparents and the lineage of it goes back more than just through me. So when you see me, just understand that I'm standing on generations of people. My great-great-grandmother who had been in slavery, but understood that her children needed as much education as they could get. They got as far as the 5th grade. And those people decided that their children should go to college, and they did. And then the next generation sent their kids to master's schools. And then the next generation, I came along and went to law school. So that's really my personal history. Within Charlotte, though, what I would say is that Charlotte is like part of the tapestry of the entire country. We have the same cognitive dissonance about some of this history that other parts of the country share. And it's interesting to have gone to different parts of the world and have seen different types of cultures deal with different manifestations of discrimination, different manifestations of difference. And in many ways, I think where our culture falls down the most is in our inability and sometimes outright refusal to acknowledge what happened. In a way that sometimes seems somewhat recalcitrant. I think we have a responsibility as a culture. And this is why I'm talking to you all tonight. It's why I believe in what the Charlotte Museum of History is really trying to help us do, is when we're able to unpack that history and understand it, even when it hurts, it gives us a capacity to heal. So fast forward through all the things that Tom talked about, and I'm asked to serve as the chair of a race and slavery commission at Davidson College. And, our job wasn't to excavate every single factual detail of the college's history as much as it was to understand the dimensions of inquiry that could be pursued, to create a process for those types of pursuits, and really to let the college community come in and fill it in. Students will be doing research projects probably for decades on this topic, and there will be conversations happening in the Davidson community about this topic probably for decades. There'll be likely books written and all kinds of manifestations of this work. But our job was really to try to put a scaffolding in place so that activity could continue in a more organized fashion. And I'll tell you one story, and I guess I want to leave some time for us to have a discussion. So I'll leave you with one story that's related to everything I've said. So as part of this, I was going through the years and years of trustees from different generations, and I came across the name of someone with the last name Kelly, who had been a trustee of Davidson back in the pre-Civil War years. And I noticed that the Kelly I was looking at, I think, trying to remember the first name as I'm talking to you, but I remember seeing that he was part of the presbytery of Moore County, where my grandmother was from. And the reason it struck me was because my grandmother's maiden name was Kelly. So I started trying to dig through and understand where there may be a connection. And of course, the historical records that don't take you but so far when it comes to African Americans in the pre-Civil War period. But my suspicion is that my family may have been owned by this same Kelly. And that was a potential learning that I developed as part of that research. And it's interesting how over a century will put things into a circle, because I'm now on the board of trustees at Davidson. So let me finish and just say that I learned a long time ago. It's one of the reasons why Tom and Jeannie are such great friends, and how I appreciate them so much, that there is so much more that binds us than that separates us. And as a politician, I found sometimes that it's somewhat harder in that venue to get that across than it is sitting across the table with a neighbor or a friend or a coworker. But in those occasions where we do have an opportunity to make very public decisions about public things that involve these issues, it's really important for all of us to come together and to try to solve them. A lot of what I tried to do in Charlotte with transportation was doing just that, and sometimes controversially. But I think in the end, the things that we tried to do then will create a city where we're all part of the same community, and the high end and the low end are hard to miss because they're all in the same place and they're all dealing with each other and trying to work out the difficult but important work of building a democracy and a civil discourse that is worthy of our people. So let me stop there. I'm happy to engage in a dialogue, and I look forward to the conversation. Can't hear you, Adria.
Sorry about that. Hopefully we've got me back online there. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your history and your family's history as a history maker in Charlotte yourself. We really appreciated hearing your thoughts on the role of history in our community, particularly the idea that we have this responsibility to unpack and understand our history, even when it hurts, that it's an opportunity to heal and to move forward. I really appreciated hearing about your optimism that, the future has this infinite capacity to overcome our past. And that's, another reason why it's so important to understand it. We're going to open the floor up to some audience questions. So if you have some questions for Anthony Foxx, please do type them into the comments. Remember, you can ask your questions, comments, and we will jump in with some questions from the audience here. I know one thing that we wanted to hear from you about was, being a student of history, how do you feel like that prepared you for success in your future careers in politics, with your legal career, and now with your corporate career?
Well, it's a great question. I don't think I would have been anywhere near the politician I was or the lawyer I was without history. And here's a couple of reasons why. One of the reasons why I was attracted to history was because it's really everything. If you study, French, you're going to learn French. If you study art, you're going to learn art. If you learn economics, you'll learn economics. But really, when you really think about it, understanding history is really trying to understand how all those things separately and together sort of form the sort of evolution of human communities. And so I being able to make historical references, being able to go take my kids to see the Appian Way, all roads lead to Rome. They got to see that road, and to be able to put it in a context, it just gives me a context to understand things. The hard thing about history, though, is that we're all constantly learning that, like everything else, we learn more as we know more. And so history is not a fixed thing. It's an evolving thing. And what's hard is when we get into these places where there are these fixed beliefs about what was true, and then those get upended by additional information, and then there's a debate about how true the information is. So I think history is incredibly important at this moment in our trajectory as a society. It's really important, and so I'm a big believer in it.
Do you have any suggestions for starting the process of unpacking this difficult history and some of the trauma that might bring up for some people as they are unpacking difficult history?
Yeah, I mean, I would steer towards action-based dialogue, and I'll tell you what that means, as opposed to dialogue for dialogue's sake. Because, you know, we have, you know, there was a study, the Harvard study that everybody talks about in Charlotte. I didn't need a Harvard study to know we had too much poverty in Charlotte, but apparently some people did. So, okay, fine. We have schools where, you know, young people are moving through and they're not getting what they need for the 21st century workforce. I mean, there's so much that's already right in front of us that, you know, sitting across the table, having some wine and cheese, talking about like how bad, you know, the world isn't going to help us as much as getting in there and mixing it up with those things that are in our way. And when I say in our way, I mean in our way as a society. So let me give you an example. Julius Chambers, who argued the Swan case, was a friend, and I would also consider him a mentor of mine. He was a very like low-key person, and he would just say a few words to you, and they would convey a whole lot of meaning if you listen carefully to what he was saying. And a few years ago, I was in the middle of like one of the toughest issues that I had faced, which was this, you know, should we build a streetcar? Should we not build a streetcar? Chambers remembered when I-77 and I-85 were built, as well as the Highway 16, which all bisected the northwest part of the city, where many African Americans from Second Ward migrated because it was the only place they could live because of redlining laws and other things. Mm-hmm. So they got moved from Second Ward there. Then highways were run through them. And so infrastructure had been like a negative. And I remember sitting across the table from him, and he just asked me very quickly, he's like, so how's the streetcar going? You know, and he knew it was a big political controversy. But then he said, you know, I'm proud of you for making that happen. And the reason why is because if, as I did, you grew up on the Beatties-Ford Road corridor, you could literally spend, I mean, the corridor has basically looked the same for like decades. And when I got into office, we put a police substation up there. I see Nancy Carter's in here. She was part of that. We put a business development park in the area where the Mecklenburg County Bar is now. We, you know, we started trying to put these pieces in place. Project Lift was another part of it. It was focused on education, but there was no economic catalyst. And now we're starting to see economic catalyzation happening in that corridor. And it's not about moving people out. I'm glad there's a land trust out there. It was really about saying, you know, there's a dry cleaners on every corner in some parts of our city. There's no dry cleaners over here. There's pharmacies and grocery stores where good, healthy foods are made, but you can't find them in some parts of the city. So why don't we create a catalyst so things can be better for everybody? That's what it was really about. Transportation was a big part of it, but also trying to get the city more evened out was a big part of it too.
Anthony, I have a question for you. You and I have talked about this, and you talked about the great positive impact your grandparents had on your life. As you were growing up in Charlotte, who were other people who had an influence on you? Other leaders, like your grandparents were obviously leaders, but other leaders who you got to know, who had a positive impact on your life, and what was that influence or that impact?
Yeah, there were so many people along the way. My church community, you know, Clifford Jones over at Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, and before him, Coleman Carey, they were both, and Clifford Jones still is, just encouraging in all of the right ways. And I mean, all the way through the time I was mayor, just giving me like an anchor when I needed it. Harvey Gantt. I went to junior high school with his kids, and in high school with one of his daughters. And, even though I know Harvey very well and love him, respect him, just like everyone does in Charlotte, it is almost not the things that he ever said to me that were so inspiring. It was, for me, it was seeing him come to like pick up his daughters after school in a suit, looking like he owned the world, and seeing an African-American man that way was just something that was unique for me. And it was just, that's the way I think of him. I've spoken about Julius Chambers. People used to talk about Julius Chambers like he was a knight in shining armor, like across, because I had educators in my house, so they were always talking about what he was doing with these court cases he had. And I thought Julius Chambers was in mythology. I didn't know that it was a real person for a long time, but he was a real person. And Mel Watt was, I'm distantly related to him through his wife. So I grew up with his kids, and he was like a surrogate father to me. So I had a lot of great people around who were doing great things and made me want to do great things. And, I can't hold a stick to any of them, but I've tried to do the best I can with what I have. I'll put it that way.
Well, you have certainly taken advantages, taken full advantage of the opportunities that, as you said, your ancestors fought hard for your generation to have, which leads me to a question we have here, which is, you have children in school now. What do you want your children to know about Charlotte's history, and what do you hope their generation will change for future generations?
I want them to know that it's not uptown. That's one thing. I'm serious. Like, it's funny, but it's true. I want them to know that it's not uptown. I really, it's one of the things I wish I had banned when I was mayor, if I could have banned it. The highest point in the city is Johnson C. Smith, the chapel at Johnson C. Smith, and I live northwest of that point. So for me, going to Center City was going downtown. So the perspective that we have when we call something like uptown is sometimes kind of tilted towards certain parts of town. So, but on a larger level, I think what I want them to, it's a little bit like what Maya Angelou said. People won't always remember what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel. That's the way I think of Charlotte. Is the city has a real soul to it, and people, even if they disagree, they're nice about it, usually, unless you're an elected official sometimes. But it's the spirit of that I think is the most important thing to me. They're growing up in Maryland, and I can't really explain that other than after Obama left office, we had a vote and I lost. So that's just what it is. But they're growing up in a place that's very different, that's not as congenial, and where the value on human connection is very different. And I want them to be Charlotteans in the way that they see the world, because I think that's the best way to be.
I love that. I think that's very optimistic, and I think it's something for all of us to strive for, to create an inclusive, welcoming environment for the future. Thank you for that comment.
Sure.
it looks like we have time for a few more questions. So if you have any other questions, comments, pop them into the chat here. Tom, was there anything else that you wanted to talk with Secretary Foxx about while we've got him on the line?
Just personal things, Anthony.
Yeah.
What are your children doing? Didn't your daughter graduate from high school this year?
No,
Oh,
thankfully.
maybe I'm 1 year behind.
No, she's going into her junior year.
Okay, well, I'm
of
behind.
high school.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
it's okay. I'm glad. I'm glad I got another couple of years with her, and my son is going into the 9th grade this year. So they are, they're just,
Yeah, well,
they're doing their thing.
Anthony has a great family and he has a beautiful, smart wife in Samara. So he's lucky to have her.
And I'm seeing some questions come in here on this comment section. I don't know about you guys. Mary Newsom, how are you, Mary? I see you.
All right, Mary asked the question. She'd love to hear more about your thoughts on transportation infrastructure and how planning can both separate and bring together different parts of the community.
Yeah, I think this is like a preview of what I think will unfold over the next decade or so in history and in historical excavation. But I think we will see a lot of academic work that will tell the story that when the highway system, and I'm gonna harp on the highway system first, but I could really be talking about the airport situation, could talk about a number of different modes of transportation, but let's just stay with highways. That when that system was developed, it reflected in every way the culture that it was imagined in, meaning that you have to go back even before the 1950s when the funding was put in place. There was discussion about a national highway system, even going back into the 1910s. The automobile took off and it was still bubbling under the surface. But as the plans were starting to be developed, it was like, we lived in a segregated society. And there was no Voting Rights Act. So there was no, critical mass of Black elected officials. There was no critical mass of even Black voters. So when you have to decide to put facilities someplace, you go to the place of least resistance. And that's where a lot of these facilities were placed. And that was very intentional. I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was in many ways very intentional. And so our highway infrastructure in many parts of the country is a sore point for people who remember that. I was talking to Wynton Marsalis, not too long ago, and he was explaining that there used to be an African American equivalent of a Mardi Gras parade that happened where the Claiborne Expressway is now in New Orleans. And when they put the expressway there, the event went away and the community around it went away. I-5 up in Seattle, I-10 in Los Angeles, I-81 in Syracuse, New York, which they're not talking about tearing down. I mean, it wasn't just in Charlotte, it was everywhere. So, the freeway system has been successful economically, but it also came with some damage that I think in retrospect was unnecessary. So how do we fix it? Okay, so the question I think Mary's asking is, what can we do about it on a go-forward basis? I think first of all, we have to realize, as much as we want to solve this problem, in one fell swoop, it's going to get solved one project at a time. So there are facilities out there that need to be either updated or repurposed or what have you. And I think there's a fair argument that there are highway facilities out there that don't provide us with an adequate travel advantage. So some of them can come down and be repurposed for open space or affordable housing or what have you. Some of them need to be reconfigured. I was part of helping a cap get put in Pittsburgh. We tore a freeway down in Rochester, New York, helped move along the Syracuse process, but that took a long time. So I think planners are critical right now. And one of the things I'm working on now is a paper where among the things I'm going to be suggesting is a national planning commission and a chief national planner along the lines of Tony Fauci or, Jerome Powell, someone who has a long term, it's not tied to the political winds, but who can help us understand the intersection of, mobility, congestion reduction, climate, but also equity. What we lack at a national level is a bird's eye view of what's happening across the system. We let it bubble up from the bottom, and that worked in the deployment of the system, I suppose. But it also came with, as I said, some disadvantages that might have been headed off if we had been thinking about what kind of society we really wanted. I guess people were thinking about what kind of society they really wanted, but it was a different society than I imagined today.
Well, and maybe that ties a bit to the question that we have here from Nancy Carter on Facebook. She says that your legacy in transportation here in Charlotte and nationally is crucial for us. And she appreciated your thoughts on aligning COVID, the color line, and climate. She says she's not as optimistic as you, but she doesn't think we're moving as fast as needed. And her question is, how can we motivate our population to take rapid action to address climate change and justice?
I'm glad you asked the question, Nancy, because I feel like now I'm like a vessel now for everything I've ever heard about justice in particular, but I could say the same thing about climate. So I talked about Julius Chambers, Harvey Gantt, Mill Watt, those guys. But someone I got to spend some time with in Washington was John Lewis. And of course, people know John Lewis's story a lot more today than they did even when I was spending a lot of time with him. But John Lewis was insistent to the day he died. He was insistent that we be optimistic about the future. And if someone who was beaten in the head walking from Montgomery to Selma and suffered innumerable other injuries along the way to create a bit of the freedom that we enjoy today, then I can be optimistic. So I think it's just, that's why history is relevant, is that we have to recognize that, yeah, things don't change just because we wake up in the morning and want them to change, but they can change and they can be better. And, we have to be forces for that. And we have to be voices for that. So, I think my part of my life right now is like trying to figure out, how do I connect all these conversations I've been a part? I mean, I feel like Forrest Gump. I've been, kind of, on this life journey. And I feel like a lot of what I've heard and paid attention to and embraced myself now needs to be put on steroids in the world. So I continue to try to figure out how to do that effectively. But Nancy, you're part of that. So don't lose hope.
Your optimism is contagious. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Anthony, Nancy says you always inspire, so maybe you're making her more optimistic.
Yeah.
Ruth Tansel has a question, slightly different subject, but there are initiatives in the Charlotte region for transportation, and there's a plan that deals with how transportation will work. What advice and what do you think about some of those plans, and what advice could you give us about that?
I think that we're in a moment right now where you either go big or you go home. Austin just passed a massive referendum putting like billions of dollars of local investment to build up their transportation system, and they're going to be at the front of the line for federal funding down the road. Los Angeles did the same thing almost a decade ago, and so what's going to happen is, federal government's going to look and try to figure out where they can make the most impact with the limited dollars they have. And they're going to, as they have been, placing that money where there's local commitment. I think that the challenge we have as a region is getting everybody on board. And the red line has been a big point of contention. I don't think it's the only one, but it's been one of those. And to be honest, I think the people in the north part of the county have a legitimate beef in some respects, because when the system was developed, it was developed with a nice group of pretty pictures that show these projects happening everywhere, but the funding was never correlated to that system. So I think a lot of people felt like, well, when we get the half cent, we're going to get this whole thing done. And I'm not sure how effective the leadership was at that time in explaining to people that, no, this was a down payment on that system. So every leader that's come along since has now had to scrap and claw and fight to try to get some progress made on that system. But the reality is, I think the way they're thinking about it now is they're saying, no, this is the real price tag to get the whole thing done, which is what I think people thought was happening back in the late 1990s. So we need to build trust. And that trust starts with like explaining the history, which is why it's good to have a museum of history, and then seeing where we can go from there. I would also say that we need to think broadly about the future. I'm when I look at the train station that's being worked on in the center city, it's underwhelming in terms of its breadth. We need a Union Station. We need a big collector there that is ready for the city we want to be. And I feel like we're still kind of in the AA, single A leagues right now in the way we're thinking about how rail is going to play a role in our future.
So think big or go home, Charlotte. That's what it's our takeaway from that. Obviously, a lot going on in transportation in Charlotte, and are planning for the 2040 plan right now. We have time for, it looks like, one more question here. Jason Williams from Facebook asks the question: as a politician and a member of the Charlotte community, how do you think that we should remember our history in a way that brings people together as opposed to keeping us apart? So how are we going to use history to reconcile on a lot of our more challenging pieces of our history?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think about this a lot in the context, a few years ago, there's a lot of discussion about statues and monuments and things, and I think it's a worthy discussion to have. And should we be recognizing certain people? Were there efforts in the past to kind of pepper the country with Confederate heroes that maybe we wouldn't think of as heroes in a contemporary context, et cetera? A slightly more interesting conversation to me is like, who should we be honoring and how should we be honoring them? Mm-hmm. I'm glad to see a Julius Chambers High School in Charlotte. To me, that's overdue. And, seeing a young person stand in front of his class, a football player, I think I saw in the paper, talk about how he was proud to be in the first class of seniors that are going to play under the Julius Chambers name. To me, that's a little bit of where the conversation can be taken. Is yes, we should look back and try to figure out what happened, and are there things that we want to change? But we should also look forward and say, what do we want to celebrate? Let me say one last thing about this, and this is my personal opinion. I don't want to forget slavery. I don't want to forget it. I don't want to forget the Civil War. I don't want to forget Reconstruction. I don't want to forget Jim Crow. I don't want to forget any of it, because what we have what is past can quickly become prelude if our society develops amnesia.
Right.
So as we're talking about these monuments and things, I think we have an obligation to think about, I have kids who are 17 and 15, and they don't, unless I tell them, which I tell them often about how I walk to school uphill both ways and all sorts of things, but unless I tell them about Swan, they don't know about Swan. They don't really understand what my experience was like because it's so different from what they're growing up in. So how are kids going to remember all these things that have happened over decades? It's a little bit like I had an opportunity when I was secretary to go to an event at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and you can't go to that museum without leaving with a heavy heart, seeing what human beings are capable of doing to each other. And I feel like that kind of catharsis is something that we lack as a society. Like, we don't want to look at it, but it's right in front of us every single day. And
Right.
So I think as we talk about all these issues around how to bring people together, it's like, I don't want to forget it.
History easily repeats itself, and we forget it to our own peril. So I think those are very good points.
I took a very good course called The Wisdom of History, and the professor had several points you learn from history. I'll always remember his first point was, we don't seem to learn from history.
Yeah.
But we need to.
Yeah.
And it's important, and people need to know about slavery, and they need to know about Jim Crow. When I was growing up, Jim Crow was in effect. And I've thought ever since, until my school integrated, supposed to integrate in 1954 and did in 1964. Until then, I had never had a discussion with a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought since then, what a shame that so many people grew up that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And that's one of the reasons why I love you, Tom, is because you do a great electric slide, by the way. But other than that, but
we'll have to see that
beyond
sometime. I'm holding you to it.
Oh, wait.
No, but beyond that, it's like, I think the problem we have is like, as an African American person, it's almost like it's easy to dismiss what I have to say about these things, from a certain point of view, because it sounds like it's self-interested. But really, I see a lot of people that are angry about this and that in our culture. But you want to talk about anger? My grandparents had a right to be angry.
Yes.
My great-great-grandmother had a right to be angry. To some extent, by extension, I have a right to be angry. But what I'd rather be is part of a society that recognizes that we are stronger as a whole and not as individual parts, and that we actually can get more things done, more economic growth, more education, more of everything. And so it's not, I'm not facile about that. But we so badly need people, white people, frankly, who have the interest and the ability to kind of look at their own experience and question it, and try to evolve in it. And so I just, it's one of the reasons why I love you, because I didn't, that's who you were when I met you. You're the same person I met several years ago. So we need more Tomcottinghams out there.
Thank you.
It's the truth.
Well,
I think we're coming up on the end of our time today. We have one last question from the audience that we will try to field, and then I think we will wrap up. The question is from Ross Danis, a friend of the museum. What are your thoughts about aligning active transportation modes with greater funding and prioritization than roads to support equitable access to trails, parks, greenways that lead to transit for all ages and abilities?
Yeah,
Talking about equitable access.
Yeah, I think it goes back to a couple of things. There's a structural answer to that question, which is, can we find more money as a society for these types of things? And we should. We absolutely should, for lots of reasons, not just the equity reasons, but health reasons. I mean, COVID has worked a number on our health from just people getting it, but also staying at home and people being so stationary. It's like we need different ways to get out and to walk and bike and do those types of things. And at the federal level, programmatically, there's just like an infinitesimal amount of money that goes into those types of modalities like bike trails and things like that. One of the things I try to do as secretary, parenthetically, is I try to, I actually, when I saw a trail project in Montana, I was like, let's do that one. When I saw one in Florida, I said, let's do that one. Wyoming, let's do that one. Why? Well, because I'd never wanted the modes of transportation to be political. I never wanted them to be red or blue. And so when there was an opportunity to put some of these types of facilities in states where you wouldn't necessarily expect it, then there was, there's a stake in it for that member of Congress or those members of the Senate. And I feel that way about transit, feel that way about a lot of things, is that we've suffered from letting these things be red and blue, and they shouldn't be. So that's the structural issue, I think, is we've got to figure out how to get more resources. The other piece, though, is the planning part. Who do we really rely on to tell us what good or bad things are going to happen if we make a choice to put one facility or another in a particular part of our community? Like what is going to be the fate of I-485 20 years from now? I predict a lot of gas station or electric charging stations maybe now, and a lot of shopping malls and apartments. That's what's going to happen. When you build those facilities, that's what happens. They put more people on it. When you build transit facilities or commuter rail facilities, things like that, you can get dense development, but you also have a travel time that's very consistent over time. So people can rely on it much differently. And some of these things like bike trails and other things not only provide a mobility alternative, they also tend to increase property values. So again, as we look at the city as a whole, when I was mayor, 75% of the property, the ad valorem tax value, was coming from the southeastern wedge of the city. That is unsustainable. And so you have to figure out ways to grow tax base while also trying to maintain some income mix in the city as best you can. So again, I think these are ways to enhance property value, enhance mobility, but you've got to have strong planning to do that, and you've got to have funding to get it done. And I'm a big believer that the federal government should be a much stronger partner there.
Thank you so much for all of your thoughts on this. We have come up on the end of our time. I want to thank you and thank Tomcottingham for joining us today. Thanks to our audience for joining us and for asking such great questions. This program is supported by Wells Fargo through the Ron Hankins History Talks lecture series. We are so grateful for their support. You can also support the museum and help us continue to offer engaging and insightful programming by donating any amount tonight at thecharlottemuseum.org/donate. So we'll have that link up in the chat. And we hope you'll visit us at the museum soon. You can find more information and tickets at charlottemuseum.org. Thank you again, Secretary Foxx, Tomcottingham, for being here. Look forward to seeing you again soon, and hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Anthony. Good to see you.
You got it. Good seeing you.
Take care.